Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the already almost the final part of the Congress. We've had an amazing time so far. I think for myself, I can speak only for myself, I've learned quite a lot, and I'm very excited about even the next panel that's going to happen. I would like to invite Ken Timsit. He is the Managing Director for ConsenSys, and they will discuss perspectives on blockchain as it regards to the European Data Protection Board. Ken, welcome on stage.
Good afternoon. I'm Ken Timsit from ConsenSys and from the EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum. It is my great pleasure to welcome on stage Ventsislav Karadjov, who is Deputy Chair of the European Data Protection Board. Mr. Karadjov, welcome and thank you for being with us today. You have been chairman of the Bulgarian Commission for Personal Data Protection since 2014. After 2 terms as vice chair of the Article 29 Working Party, you were elected unanimously as a deputy chair for the European Data Protection Board since May 2018. Earlier in your career, you held senior legal and management positions on projects concerning anti-corruption and the creation of functioning democratic institutions at the Ministry for Internal Affairs of Bulgaria, the Central Election Commission of the Republic of Bulgaria, as well as for international institutions such as the European Commission, US Agency for International Development, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the UN Development Programme. Thank you for being with us. And so the topic of today's discussion is GDPR and the interactions between blockchain and the respect and protection of personal data. So, Mr. Karadjov, before we dive into blockchain technology, so you started in your current position when GDPR became in force in May 2018. And I'm sure that the last few months have been very intense in terms of setting up the Data Protection Board and then dealing with the incoming flow of issues and requests. So before we talk about blockchain specifically, can you tell us a little bit how the last few months have been and what were your priorities?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to talk in front of that professional audience. I'm not a big expert on blockchain. I have some general knowledge about it, so please bear with me. But I'm a good expert on data protection, and I think that will be very helpful to you on understanding the concepts and also the behavior of the data protection authorities and the European Data Protection Board as the umbrella responsible for the consistent implementation of these rules throughout Europe. First of all, you're very correct, very right of the fact that we have a lot of challenges because we are in the phase of the implementation of the GDPR. We have almost more than 1.5 years of implementation, but we have to separate implementation into 2 sub-phases if the implementation itself is a phase. And this is the first one, that is the awareness and training, and the second one is the enforcement. Because the first year we've been more or less into the first sub-phase. We've did our awareness towards controllers and processes, towards data subjects. I mean, the data subject rights were not very well explained to the European citizens, and that was the role of the data protection authorities and of the board of course, to explain that rules, to make citizens aware of the opportunities to defend their rights. And we are approaching now the second subphase, which is the enforcement, where we have to supervise the way how the data protection authorities and processors of data comply with these rules, and if they are not complying, to advise them how to improve their procedures, internal procedures, for example, and if they don't still comply, to be sanctioned in order to establish a preventive environment. So that's quite a challenge, because this does not happen for one day. We have, as Working Party 29, and you are very correctly explained the audience, that is the predecessor of the European Data Protection Board. We've adopted 16 guidelines that have been endorsed by European Data Protection Board, and in addition, we've already worked over 15 more guidelines, 7 which are now in the pipeline to be adopted. And it's a lot of consultation with the business, because we, as a data protection authority, as the European body, value the information coming from the business, the feedback, and to the extent possible, we would like to involve it in the guidelines to be more practical and useful. We are also aiming to adopt new guidelines on data protection by design and default that will come very soon. Also guidelines on the data subjects' rights, for the reason I did explain earlier. And the guideline on territorial scope is probably today in a discussion on a plenary, and maybe possible adoption there, which you know is quite an important area of implementation that will follow on after its adoption. And on behalf of the European Data Protection Board, I would say that there is a lot of effort done for consistency and for consistent implementation and understanding before the implementation of the rules. Because, you know, for example, for certain areas like the binding corporate rules, like different activities where the member states cannot take a decision for the for that impact assessment, for example. They have to consult with the board, and that is how consistency goes through the Europe. And for that reason, even the code of conducts and the certification is not possible without the prior consultation of the board. So that's a lot of effort, because the board works through the experts of the data protection authorities, and their knowledge has to be provided in various subgroups before it goes to plenary for discussion. So generally said, that's a lot of effort, and I would like to praise the efforts of my colleagues also on developing all these instruments that are in active use by all of you here.
All right, thank you very much. We will continue with the questions, but before we do that, I want to remind you that you can ask questions through the Slido. You go to sli.do, type convergence as the meeting name, go to auditorium 1, and then you can ask questions. The most voted question will be answered at the end of this session. So moving on to blockchain, as part of the EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum, we had very early on the mandate of looking into GDPR implications for blockchain. That was one of the first reports that we published. Also, that was the core focus of several of our initial workshops. And many people at those meetings started asking the question, is blockchain GDPR compliant or not? And very quickly it became evident, at least to us, that that's not the right question. Some use cases are GDPR compliant or are implemented in GDPR compliant ways, others not. It's not so much about the technology, it's about how it's used. So I want to ask the question of you. Overall, when you look at blockchain technology, what has been your approach and your mental framework to determine, to think about GDPR compliance?
First of all, I would like to be very clear that the European Data Protection Board has not adopted guidelines on blockchain, and this is anticipated to happen in the next year because it is the work plan that we adopted for the year of 2019 and year of 2020. It's a lot of analysis that we have to do because the blockchain, as I would like to agree with you, is not data processing corporation in itself. It is a technology which can serve a diverse range of processing operations. And from that perspective, while data is processed, it should be done under the rules of the General Data Protection Regulation. There is no other way. Whoever processes personal data, it should be under these rules or under the e-privacy rules that are anticipated. For good or bad, these rules exist since 1981, and for 14 years, the notions that exist here of processor, of controller, are well established into the legal framework, which is, meanwhile, quite, I would say, neutral to the different technologies. So yes, there is a big potential into the blockchain technology, but it has to prove also that processing of personal data within the chain is compliant with the rules. This is what I have to, this is what I can comment right now. Of course, in addition to the opinion of the European Data Protection Board, it might be needed for the European solution, if so. But I would say that the blockchain is not the first technology and not the last technology that will appear. And for 14 years, these rules has proved that they are effective and they are workable, I would say.
Thank you. So you arrived here yesterday, and you have met with a number of blockchain enthusiasts, perhaps also skeptics. You have had perhaps conversations with project owners or researchers about important questions that they had regarding GDPR and blockchain, challenges that they were meeting. Would you like to comment on some of the questions or issues that people have talked to you about and how you typically respond to their concerns?
Well, yeah, people are enthusiastic about the new technology. I myself am also enthusiastic because I'm working in the public sector, and for me, the blockchain is a technology that can be used in the e-government, providing services to citizens because of the transparency, the accountability there, the verifiability of data. But the blockchain has to prove, for example, that no one is going to forge our identity. And we are not going to change the criminal legislation instead of changing the data protection legislation from that perspective. Yes, we need the blockchain as a technology, but the blockchain has to further develop in order to serve the interest of the individual, because the technology itself is not developed only for the fact that it is unique, but it is also developed to serve the mankind. So that is my perspective. And it is the perspective of the board, because in our focus is the individual and the way how his or her data is processed for different commercial purposes, for security purposes, and etc. So yes, from the perspectives of the board, there are some concerns. And the concerns basically are that once the data is there, it may stay for indefinite period of time, if I can say so. But the principles of the GDPR, if you go very easily on Article 5, is about accuracy, about minimization, about use of data for processing as far for a certain period of time as far as it is needed for the purpose, and also fair treatment, fair processing of data compared to the fair treatment to the data subject. So if the data is not correct, for example, because no one verifies this data, especially in the public blockchains, in the public permissionless blockchains, no one verifies this data. And if the data turns out that is not correct, how we are gonna exercise as individuals our right for correction, for accuracy, and also for erasure if needed. This is not possible. Yeah, this is good for the network because it can prove that the network is stable, and once data is there, no one can change it, and etc. But it contradicts to our data protection rights. It's not only my data protection rights; it's all of you data protection rights here. If that happens, for example. And there is another problem with the public permissionless networks based on blockchain technology, that everybody from everywhere can access that data, especially if it is personal data. But under the data protection rules, third countries which does not have adequacy decisions for processing of this data, they don't have the right to access it, and the business there doesn't have the right to process it in various ways. So indeed, the permissionless network circumvents the rules on data protection on Chapter 5, which is the most important. That's why we have, let's say, the privacy shield right now in a negotiation, and these days we are commenting whether the United States adequately protect the EU citizens' data there compared to, for example, the rules of the data protection regulations, and we supervise that. Then we'll have the same issue with Britain if there's the Brexit case. We have the same issues with many other countries. For example, Japan changed their legislation to meet these requirements. And so if we have kind of a technology that is overtaking all these efforts of a lot of experts, then we have to think about it, whether and how useful it is.
Thank you. So you talked about some challenges in this context, and you talked in particular about public blockchains. So we totally understand the challenges raised by those blockchains. We also realize that they exist right now, that they hold dozens of billions of dollars in value, that there is today around 2 million transactions per day on those networks altogether. So they are here. Do you foresee, therefore, that under certain conditions, the rules of GDPR could be clarified or perhaps adapted to account for this situation in the future?
Well, I don't anticipate it. As I said, the GDPR is neutrally based legislation. It is not biased to any technology or to any rules, so it is applicable since, as I said, 1981. These are not new concepts. A lot of technologies appeared and went down, and these rules still stays here and they protect us. You know, people may not like that there are guards on the border, but the guards are useful. Huh? And so we don't like the traffic police, but they're doing their job. So this is our job to protect the citizens' rights. So I don't expect a change because of the blockchain technology.
All right, thank you. Let's move to the questions from the audience now. And I will unlock my phone. So, first question. Would EDBP endorse the paper from the CNIL in France about GDPR and blockchain? You can see the questions here.
Yeah, well, as I said, CNU is part of the EDPB. We are 28 authorities. If CNU paper is provided to the attention of these experts, they would discuss the positive of the paper. But I don't expect that the paper will be endorsed by EDPB. There are a lot of other experts that will participate, and their opinion also would be very valuable for us when we are taking a decision. Plus, the EDPB does not work in a way of endorsing some paper from data protection authorities. It takes the decision after a consultation with the business and the various counterparts, different associations of, let's say, of businesses as well. And after that consultation, we adopt the best, I would say, concept on behalf of the EDPB and clarifying the EDPB understanding about the data protection rules when we talk about blockchain.
Okay, thanks. Let's continue. We still have a few minutes. So the next question is about data hashes. Right? So hashes are kind of fingerprints of data. I'm assuming that most of you in the room are familiar with hashes of data. And I know also that as part of the working party, Article 29 working party, you published a number of opinions on data hashes. So the question is, have you thought about ways that we could explain to the audience how hashes of personal data should be treated and processed as in order to remain compliant with GDPR?
What do you mean hashes of personal data? I'm not very well aware about that.
Oh, so by hashes, people mean non-reversible encryption of personal data that concatenates personal data into strings of typically 256 characters that identify uniquely that piece of data without it being possible to take the hash and revert it back to the original data. Yeah. So hashes are oftentimes used to anchor data or prove that some data has been generated at some point.
Yeah, I understand that. Well, we have to examine that as board in our subgroups as well, because if the impossibility for reversion, let's say, very high, then we can talk about anonymized data. And for anonymized data, the GDPR is not applicable, as everybody knows. So it is a matter of testing that system and confirming that it is not possible to reverse the data back so that the person to be identifiable or identified.
Thank you. Next question. So the question is about private permissionless blockchains. So private permissionless blockchains means blockchains where the nodes that can validate data need to be approved, but anyone can read the data written on those ledgers. And so the question is, do you have a preliminary vision or definition of controllership in the context of private permissionless blockchains?
As a European Data Protection Board representative, I don't, but as I told you already, we are in the process of developing these guidelines. But as an expert in data protection, I would say that the private permissionless networks are very good for e-services. Because of this fact, I would say that there would be a very clear controller. Also, there might be a processor depending on whether the government will, for example, appoint an agency to process all these data of various departments or ministries, for example. And it's very appropriate for, let's say, for commercial registers. It is very appropriate for property registers, for cadastral registers, for various registers, let's say, related with convictions and conviction certificates. So e-health also is quite appropriate for that. So I would say that there is, as a technology, blockchain can significantly improve that e-government services.
Thank you. And so one last question. So there are several questions in the Slido about the right to change data, erase data, revoke access to data, all things which are not as easy to do on some blockchain networks as when all the data is stored and controlled by a single party. Can you share with the audience what advice you would give to them if they are starting a blockchain project and trying to deal with how they will manage data change, data erasure, and revocation of consent?
Well, it depends what business you are doing. You know, first of all, in the data protection regulation, there is one principle for appropriateness of the measure. So the controller should consider what measure, what action, what activities, for example, are very appropriate for the processing, for the type of processing. So he has to consider the purpose and also the result of the processing. And based on that, he has to select the appropriate measure and also the appropriate safeguards. And I would say that the blockchain has to be considered in that perspective, between the purpose and the result, and as a safeguard, let's say, because of the security of the information, because of the accountability of the controller, and so on and so forth. It depends what type of business you want to develop. If it is, for example, inventory business, the blockchain is very appropriate because it will be very transparent, accountable, and you can follow the history. And if it is, let's say, fast food delivery, also very appropriate, you know, because everybody can follow where the, let's say, the delivery is and what delivery is anticipated. So it depends from the business, I would say, from the purpose.
Thank you. So that's it for today. When we finished the GDPR sessions in the EU Blockchain Observatory, we came to the conclusion that many questions that entrepreneurs are asking will only have answers once we see a case go to court. Unfortunately, or fortunately, so far it hasn't happened. I'm not aware of privacy cases that involve blockchain and that have been tried yet in recent months. So let's see how what the coming months have in store for us. I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Karadjov, for being with us and being so didactic and clear in your comments. So a round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you very much for this enlightening discussion. If I look at the audience and if I see how many people are here, I think that this subject, is definitely one that needs exploring. How does blockchain have an influence on the GDPR and on our personal data? I, for sure, as a blockchain professional, find that discussion extremely interesting. So thank you again very much. So my next speaker is Mr. Daniel Benarroch from QEDIT. He is the lead cryptographer. It's a hard word even for me. He's going to explore today some of the state-of-the-art cryptography and also explore some of the concept of zero-knowledge proof. So welcome to the States and give him a good round of applause, Mr. Daniel Benarroch.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here today, and thanks to the organizers for this very well-planned conference, and very important indeed. So, my name is Daniel Benarroch, and I'm the lead cryptographer at QEDIT, which is a company building enterprise solutions based on zero-knowledge proofs, which is a privacy-enhancing cryptographic tool. And I'm also the main organizer of the ZK proof standardization effort, which essentially aims to standardize the use of zero-knowledge proofs in order to pave the path for adoption of this technology. But let's first try to understand why are we even talking about these kind of technologies, right? So we have seen or heard just now in the previous fireside chat that privacy is a concern and data rights are a concern, right? So we all are aware that we're going through an era of digital transformation, right? This means that now companies are collecting vast amounts of data. And this data is personal data that allows the companies to build new business models, to monetize on this data and create new revenue streams. The problem is, and this is all good, right? But the problem is that some companies may abuse this data or may use the data in somewhat unethical ways. This is why regulatory bodies are publishing new kind of policies. And these policies in the last decade have been increasingly around privacy protection of personal data. This is the main reason why companies and enterprises are now looking at ways and techniques to solve this problem, to maintain and enable the collaboration that is provided by having this data without having to share the data or maintaining and abiding by the regulation. But let's try to understand for a second what zero-knowledge proofs is, right? So some of the tools that these companies are looking at are essentially derived from cryptography, right? The state of the art of these privacy tools today come from advanced cryptography. One of those tools that we're going to talk about today is zero-knowledge proofs. Now, zero-knowledge proofs allows a party A, say Alice, to prove to a party B, Bob, that she has some data and she has some computation on her data that is correct and valid without actually sharing that data. So just a quick example, if Alice would like to prove her credit score computation, instead of sharing all of her financial data, she can now share a zero-knowledge proof that will attest to the validity of her financial data. Now, there are other techniques in cryptography that can be used for different purposes. For example, homomorphic encryption. I don't know if you've heard of this term, but homomorphic encryption allows a certain party to outsource computation to a cloud server without actually sharing the data. Now, this is pretty big. The party A, Alice, can encrypt her data, send it to the cloud. The cloud can compute whichever analysis on that data it wants, or she wants, such as a machine learning model, and then send back the result encrypted so that Alice can decrypt the result and get the correct answer for her model, without the server seeing the data nor the result. Another tool that we have in cryptography and is currently being developed more and more is multi-party computation. Now, multi-party computation allows for several parties to come together and compute some function on their individual sets of data without sharing their private data with each other, right? So if we think about an example of health, for example, where insurance companies would like to see whether there is some kind of fraudulent claim. Well, each insurance company cannot share their data with each other, but they would like to see which claims are actually fraudulent, right? Now, in this talk, we're going to focus on zero-knowledge proof specifically, which is the one that is mostly advanced in terms of deployment and practicality. And zero-knowledge proofs enables trusted collaboration between untrusted parties. Let's keep this in mind, okay? This idea of trust and privacy usually has been detached from each other, and now we want to bring it together. So what exactly is zero-knowledge proofs, right? We've been thinking about how to use it a little bit, but I'm going to assume that everybody here knows about the Where is Waldo book, right? This children's book that you need to find the little figure of Waldo, of the stripes within this big picture, such as what we see here. And if you haven't seen this example before, or you weren't yesterday in Jonathan's talk, then this is relevant for you. Essentially, last summer, I bought this book of Where is Waldo for my kid. And when my kid started looking into Waldo and looking for Waldo, he spent some hours looking for Waldo, but he couldn't find Waldo. So at some point, he came to me and he said, "Dad, I'm going to give up. I can't find Waldo, and I don't think Waldo's here." So of course, as a father, I want to encourage my kid to keep looking and to find a solution. How do I prove to my kid that Waldo is there without showing him where Waldo is, without revealing to him this private information that now can be so valuable for his education, right? Well, I took a big black envelope, 4 times the size of the picture, and I cut a little figure of Waldo in the middle of this envelope. Now, I put the figure inside, and I showed him that the figure of Waldo is indeed in the picture, because you could see Waldo from the little hole, but he could not see or know where the figure was positioned, hence not knowing where Waldo is. Then I just shook the actual envelope, gave it to him with the book, and then he went on and actually ended up finding Waldo. So, success story, right? Now, this is a physical analogy for what zero-knowledge proofs are. In real life, the actual cryptographic algorithms are based on very advanced mathematics, right? Mathematics that hold this idea of trust and truth in the schemes. So let's look a bit more at a bit more relevant use cases. So where can we use zero-knowledge proofs? For example, let's talk about this collaborative KYC. In the traditional setting, let us think of a company, a digital wallet company, for example, that would like to provide financial services to their clients by onboarding or by using a loan provider. Now, in the traditional setting, this loan provider would actually get the data from the digital wallet users, a copy of this data, in order to run the KYC process themselves. They have their own requirements, and they would like to check that on the actual data. Well, in the case of zero-knowledge proofs, what happens instead is that the digital wallet can actually share a zero-knowledge proof computed on the data based on the loan provider's requirements to the loan provider, who can then verify that this proof is valid and correct, attesting to the validity of the KYC process, right? And the mathematical truth ensures that this is the case. Now, where do we use blockchains here? Well, blockchain can be used in order to ground the actual data, right? In order for us to put hashes on the blockchain of this data, as Ken explained very well earlier, and point or reference to these hashes as an undeniable source of truth, right? So these are very interesting use cases. And essentially the question is, how do we bring zero-knowledge proofs adoption to the enterprise world? As we see with many technologies in the past decades and centuries, and what we will see in the future, is that nascent technologies are hard to bring adoption, especially if they're based on mathematics and where it is hard for everybody, mainstream, to understand this technology. Well, the answer to this, and this is what we're going to talk today about, is ZK Proof. Now, ZK Proof is a community-driven effort to standardize the use of zero-knowledge proofs. We're working hard to bridge the gap between the industry and academia in order to transfer this line of truth, of mathematical truth, from the academia to the industry. This specifically is a picture of our second workshop that took place earlier this year in April, back at Berkeley in California. This workshop brought together a lot of different institutions. So here you can see some of the main sponsors, such as QEDIT, the Zcash Foundation, Deloitte, VMware. Big corporations are joining this effort. Developer communities are joining this effort, inclusive, and especially also the researchers and academics from universities such as Columbia, MIT, Stanford. We're also seeing collaboration from other standard bodies, which is very important in order to bring adoption. The National Institute of Standards Technology has been helping us in order to, and collaborating with us, in order to bring to the world, to the industry, a set of documents for reference and recommendations on how to use zero-knowledge proofs. So where do we stand today? So far, in the last 2 years of existence for zkproof, we've had 4 different events that brought over 200 cryptographic experts from the industry and the academia, and all the way in between, developers and engineers. Our community currently is based over more than 400 researchers, developers, and practitioners that are actively discussing the most pressing topics in order to bring standardization. The standardization is focused on zero-knowledge proofs, but has applications to blockchains, and hence this is where blockchain come in the effort. Our steering committee is composed of 12 of the top cryptographic professors in the world, from universities like Stanford and Berkeley, like we said before, such as the co-inventor and Turing Award winner of zero-knowledge proofs, Professor Shafi Goldwasser from Berkeley University. Also, we have Dan Bonnet, Professor Dan Bonnet, who is a professor of computer science at Stanford University. And we have Jens Groth, who is the inventor of the most advanced and efficient scheme of zero-knowledge proofs that is today in production. We've managed in these 2 years to collaborate with the community in order to write more than 200 pages of documentation, ranging all the way from reference material for education purposes to guidelines and best practices, as well as standards proposals that are being written by the community. Now, what do we mean when we standardize? What is it that we're actually doing? What's the important step to take in order to bring it to adoption? We see here that what we're actually doing is build a trust ecosystem for this technology. On the one hand, we have the academic researchers that are building the schemes, that are doing the innovation back in their universities and institutions, and are basing these schemes in mathematics. They're using mathematics to prove theorems and statements about the security and the correctness of these tools and of these protocols. Now, these protocols have an underlying line of truth, and this is what we try to bring all the way across the board. The scientific community comes and verifies this mathematics. They verify the schemes, and they ensure that they are actually secure. The engineers and the developers come in and say, okay, I'm now going to implement this scheme. This involves making it secure, as we will see in a second. And then we have the integrators and the clients, which take these the applications developed on top of that use the zero-knowledge proofs and bring it to adoption, right, and deployment. But let's look a little bit more in depth about what this actually means. As we said, this field of research is growing very fast. Zero-knowledge proofs were created 30 years ago. That's a long time. But only in the last 5 years, we've seen this technology become practical enough in order to become deployed. Now, once we have deployment, this means that researchers are motivated to actually look into further problems that are relevant for the real world. At ZK-Proof, we encourage this research. It is important to continue doing innovation so that we can get to a point where this is adopted. But at the same time, we are actually taking a slow motion snapshot of the current state in order to develop the best practices and the standards needed in order for enterprise to use these tools. Otherwise, it would not be possible. Let's look at it now from the engineering side of things. We see at the bottom here of the pyramid that the schemes and the security lie. This is where the researchers work. This is what they are building. And now we need to go all the way up to the application level, which is what's going to be deployed. In the standardization effort, we are working to standardize the APIs and the programming languages that are using or that are calling these schemes. We need to develop these APIs in a secure manner in order for the code and the software not to have any vulnerabilities. This is specifically sensitive and relevant when talking about cryptography, because cryptography has a very important component of security that other software systems may not necessarily have. Next level, we have the benchmarks. Benchmarks are extremely useful in order for the practitioners to know what zero-knowledge schemes they can actually use. Now, today we don't have an all-encompassing and best zero-knowledge proof scheme. We have many very good zero-knowledge proof schemes, and every application may have a different trade-off of what's best to use for their specific use case. In building this zero-knowledge infrastructure that we can see here, in order to bring this to deployment, it's imperative that we're going to think about the interoperability of systems using zero-knowledge proofs. If we don't, then there is a potential failure here. Let's think about the MP3 example, for example. If we didn't have a standard format for music files, well, you wouldn't be able to play your songs in iTunes and in Spotify and in their TV. And that would be a problem. The same would happen with applications of zero-knowledge proof systems. So let me give you an example of an interoperability standard that is currently being discussed and standardized at ZK-Proof. This is called ZK interface. And the key point to remember here is that let's give a little bit of context first, actually. In the beginning of the zero-knowledge proof time, there was only one library. And this library allowed you to program your applications in zero-knowledge and to prove whatever statements you were going to prove. A bit later came the second library. And now you have two libraries that each one has a programming language and a proving system, but you cannot use each other with each other. This is analogous as if we had today that Netflix could only be used with a Samsung TV and Hulu or Amazon Prime could only be used with LG. This would be ridiculous. I'm not going to buy two TVs to watch independent services. And hence, with ZK interface, what we do is we created this interface, a file format, that actually allows us to map any programming language to any proving system. And this allows any developer or practitioner to choose which of the two is their favorite or which one has the best trade-off for their application. Finally, in this scheme to build a trust ecosystem, it is extremely important that we will work towards bridging the gap in terminology. Semantics is very important when it comes to zero-knowledge proofs. Let's see, for example, where we're talking about the KYC process. When we think traditionally about KYC, as we saw before, we heard before, the thing to think about is that you're running the KYC on your servers. Now, when we think about zero-knowledge proof setting, well, actually, you're not running the data itself of the process, you're actually running a verification of the proof, and you do not hold the data. This is a difference in semantics that is important in order to bring adoption of zero-knowledge proofs, because if we're all not in the same page, then we do not know how to communicate. Now, this is similar for the data retention or the client relation situation where a client in the general setting, the traditional setting, may interact with multiple parties in order to get the services. Whereas, for example, now with zero-knowledge proofs, the client can manage one single relation and still get all of the services, such as the example we gave before of the loan provider and the digital wallet. And the question here is that in order to bridge this gap and in order to get to this point, to understand the same terminology and to create all the standards, we need to bring to the same table the researchers, the developers, the practitioners, the consumers, and everybody in between in order to agree on this. That's what it means to have a community-driven effort. And most of these discussions take place physically and online, but the heavy weight of the influence on these standards take place at our annual workshops. And with this, I would like to invite you all to join our third workshop, which will take place in London in the 4th and 6th to the 6th of April. And here we will discuss the most pressing issues for standardization. We're going to invite more regulatory bodies and more standardization bodies. And I would like to invite all the regulatory bodies to adopt somewhat of this terminology and to think about how to involve cryptography and zero-knowledge proofs in their recommendations when thinking about blockchain, because privacy is a real issue. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Are we doing questions with
Let's see. There are 2 questions for you.
Oh, great. So I'll read the question out loud. The first one is, have you conducted structured performance benchmarks with respect to realistic applications to assess the practical viability of your proposed ZKP approaches? That's a very good question. We do actually have some benchmarks with respect to some applications. For example, we have benchmarks for proving the existence of some token or the ownership and existence of some token in the blockchain. And I mean, I could give some numbers, but I think it may not be necessary right now. And the key point to remember here is that we're also building the kind of infrastructure or the framework to create the benchmarks necessary to compare the schemes. The next question, can you mention concrete projects that are already using ZKP in a real production environment, and how are these projects using ZKP? Great. So the first part is actually there is a currently deployed system using zero-knowledge proofs. It's the Zcash cryptocurrency or ecosystem. They deployed their blockchain about 3 years ago, and they managed to get a lot of user base, and they're working hand in hand with all of the different collaborators at the ZK Proof effort to bring all of this experience to life. At QEDIT, we've worked on many projects, and we've built several products and prototypes with different companies to bring these systems to adoption. And the third question, when will your ZKP approach be ready for mainstream adoption? Okay, so I'm not going to repeat the whole talk, but essentially we are working on it, right? We're not sure when mainstream adoption is going to come. We've so far seen blockchain have a hard time to get into mainstream adoption, so I'm not expecting zero knowledge to go mainstream in the next months. So yes, there is another question that I cannot see here. So, do you have contact with Sovereign, Hyperledger, Indy to standardize their ID system? That's a very good question, and the answer is that yes, because Sovereign is actually part of the ZK Proof standardization effort. We worked together very hard on the first workshop to build a kind of reference for how to build identity systems based on zero-knowledge proofs. You can go today, right now, to the zkproof.org website and check the reference document that is there. And in the application section, you will find this identity scheme. So, thank you again, everyone. and thank you, the organizers.
I'm going to put some tables up. Thank you, Daniel. So thank you, Daniel, for enlightening us and exploring the concepts of zero-knowledge proof. Again, a very welcoming topic as we are in a digital transformation, that we're living in a digital world. As the table is being set, it's my pleasure already to introduce our next panel, or at least the moderator of the panel, Mr. Tom Lyons. He is the executive director with ConsenSys, but also gave me a heck of a lot of reading work through his EU Observatory forum. He is also the report manager that has come forth with many reports, one of them actually being the GDPR report. So that is, again, a lot of reading work, but next to that, he's an amazing moderator. I'd like to welcome to the stage Mr. Tom Lyons. I couldn't talk for more. I couldn't stand anymore.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tom Lyons, as Pascal said, and I work for the, so I'm a part of the European Union Blockchain Observatory and Forum, which is one of the sponsors of this event. And I also work for ConsenSys, one of the largest pure-play blockchain companies in the world. I'm based in Switzerland. And while we're setting up, I'd like to just express my gratitude to everybody who's come out today. We've spent a lot of time organizing this conference, and I really hope you all have enjoyed it so far. So without further ado, I'd like to ask the panelists to come up. Everybody? Okay, welcome everybody. Nice to see you here. The topic of this panel is data privacy in a decentralized world. And the idea that we sort of had in mind was that to end this particular session on privacy, we opened with the regulator. We opened with the European Data Protection Board. And then we, to talk about GDPR, to talk about privacy and regulation from that aspect. Then we followed that with quite a technical talk into zero-knowledge proofs, and the reason we wanted to get into technology of privacy is because in the blockchain space, where when you're dealing with decentralized technologies, it's obvious if data is being decentralized one way or the other, that privacy is going to be a concern. And a lot of people have been looking to these privacy-preserving technologies to sort of come maybe on top of blockchains, be used with blockchains in order to add a privacy element to it. So that was how we went into the tech. And I think what we'd like to do on this panel is kind of try to bring those things together and look at how we can some of the challenges facing developing a privacy-preserving blockchain platforms, and really kind of look at the whole data discussion, which I think is important to all of us. It's certainly something I think a lot about, and I think pretty much these days we all do, from two different angles. There's the angle of data protection, of our personal data, but there's also the angle of data value. So data has a value, not just a monetary value. Obviously, as we know, it has large monetary value, but it also has a knowledge value to an extent. There's research, there's a lot to be learned, let's say, from big data. So we put together a panel that's actually rather diverse from different backgrounds, and I think it makes a lot of sense for this kind of panel to, if first everybody introduces themselves and gives a bit of their background, where you're working and what your background is and what angle you're coming to the whole data privacy discussion from. And I'll just start going to my right with Bart.
Hi, my name is Bart Preneel. I'm an academic and I have a background in cryptography. I also am interested in crypto. I have some students I work with who look at the stability and security of Bitcoin and alternative schemes for proof of work. And I have a history going back to blockchain. It's quite old. In fact, I can argue that I managed a blockchain project in the 90s, and this project is actually cited in the Bitcoin paper. So I have a long-term interest in this topic. In general, my interest is also in privacy and how we can use cryptographic technologies to actually protect privacy better and how to reconcile privacy and utility of data. And I also happen to have a small role as a member of the expert committee of the Belgian DPA.
Hi, my name is Marie Wallace, and I'm a data scientist. I'm a blockchain newbie, so I literally am just a recent convert. I guess about a year ago, I got introduced to self-sovereign identity, and I've been kind of working in that space since. But my background as a data scientist, I spent nearly 20 years building AI technology, and over the last decade, specifically over the last probably 5 or 6 years, have become very, very intimately concerned about the privacy and the ethical aspects of data science. And so have been a long time looking for what would the next data ecosystem look like. And currently believe blockchain could play a critical part of that. So that's predominantly what I'm looking at the moment inside IBM, specifically focused on the healthcare sector.
Okay. Hello, my name is Enrique Factor, and I work for the Spanish Data Protection Agency, the Agencia Española de Protección de Datos. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for having me here in this and giving me the opportunity to share this panel with you. My background, it's, well, I'm a civil servant. I'm working in the Agencia for 1.5 years. And my studies are more in the philology part of the science, but I've been working for 25 years as a civil servant in computer science and a system administrator and computer. So, well, my interest here is just to show you or try to explain how the agency, the Data Protection Authority works, and how we can find solutions to the many challenges that blockchain will show, and I'm sure we can find a way of balance correctly the interest of the blockchain enthusiasts and the protection of the personal data.
Enrique, just to jump in, so you and I have that in common. I also started out studying literature and got into technology. So, and I think that's a valid perspective to bring.
Hi, I studied electrical engineering, so maybe I'm the more part of the technical side. My name is Jonathan Rouach. I'm CEO and co-founder of QEDIT. It's written QEDIT. It's actually a pun, but what my background is, I started a company in the blockchain space already in 2013 called Bits of Gold, and that became the largest Bitcoin and Ethereum exchange in Israel. And then from there, we co-founded a company in the security of digital assets, and that company was acquired by Digital Asset Holding, which is a large company in Wall Street. And that's around that time I saw that banks and large industries are looking to adopt blockchain technology. They started to differentiate between cryptocurrency and blockchain, but they're kind of missing or not talking about the elephant in the room, which is that all the data is going to leak to all the nodes in the network. And it seemed odd that, you know, we're devoting so much energy and effort to hype up a technology with a flaw at its heart. You cannot deploy it in production systems with large companies. So we were actually a bunch to recognize that, and we formed QEDIT to solve this through the angle of zero-knowledge proofs. And it's a double challenge now to be talking in front of regulators that are pushing GDPR and in front of the inventor, co-inventor of zero-knowledge proofs present in the room, Professor Silvio Micali. So I'm going to do my best to represent this tech.
I'm sure we're all going to be doing our best. So as you see, we put together a diverse panel. The way I like to think of it is Bart, you're representing the sort of academic cryptography community. Marie, you're the data scientist in the group. We have the regulator, and Jonathan, I put you in the category of the practitioner of the zero knowledge proofs. But what we really have to start with, and this is a question for all of you, is I don't know how many people saw this, but we got the news yesterday that apparently there's been a whistleblower who's come out and revealed that Google has an agreement with the second largest healthcare provider or insurance company in the US, Ascension, under which they're basically getting the personal health records, unencrypted, also identifiable health records from about 50 million US citizens, so patients in this group. And if that's true and how that plays out, we don't know yet, but that's, for a lot of us, really, really shocking. So since it's shocking, I'm going to play devil's advocate. I'm going to come from the other side, and Google and Ascension have come out and said, well, we're doing this legally. Don't know what that is, how this is going to work out. But there is, as I said in the beginning, there is this tension between valid uses of data, the value of data, and personal privacy. So having played the devil's advocate, and I'm going to start with you, Marie, what do you think about this revelation? Here we go.
Yeah, he knows I'm going to rant about this. I'll be politically correct. But so I guess, so I've never been a big fan of privacy as a term, because I think it's more about ethics, that you can follow the letter of the law without following really by being ethical. And for me, it doesn't really matter. I mean, if it's legal, then the US regulation really needs to trim things up. So I guess what I actually tweeted about this morning, that I hope both of those two organizations, if this is indeed true, and they've done this without consent, which I can imagine if it's 50 million people, there hasn't been direct consent, that they get sorely punished for it. But secondly, that it hopefully will influence the regulations that we see around privacy in the US, because I think it doesn't matter. The value conversation is important, but I think if you're taking away somebody's right to their data, and particularly healthcare records, that's your right to your genes, your right to everything that is part of you. If you take away that right, then what are we as a society? So I kind of think we have to first and foremost think about an individual's right to privacy, a right to their body, a right to choose, and then the value comes after that. That's my opinion.
I think to extend that, you don't even need to do this. You don't need to collect. There's now privacy-enhancing tools that let you combine data. We just heard before in Daniel's presentation, a multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption. Google is actually pushing some of those libraries. They have really good cryptographers. They could take the time to look at that problem with a bit more care to the subtleties of private data management. So it's doubly surprising. Why did they do that? They could be leading the way in finding the cure for cancer while preserving privacy.
I'm normally not in a position to defend Google. We also have to be honest to say that these technologies exist, and I'm also a great advocate. But of course, they don't scale yet to the gigabytes and terabytes. And I think we should also, on the one hand, defend these technologies and go for it. But we should not claim that we can do everything we can do on clear text in the same speed and performance. On this specific news item, I'm actually shocked people are shocked about this. Why are people surprised? There is a website, Information is Beautiful, where you can look at the data leaks, and this is unintentional leaks. And there are billions of records there, and every month there is another big leak of more than 100 million records. So this is maybe a bit more shocking because it's healthcare data, a bit more shocking because it was handed over voluntarily, but more or less what we heard several times is data is the new oil. So if you consider data as the new oil, why are you surprised about pollution?
All right, I have to step back and. No. The thing is that I would like to step back and just that's something that happened in the United States, which has quite a different a legal framework for this. So the situation is not compatible. But in a way, I'm happy that this happened and this raised so many buzz about it, because this show the importance and also the problems that the privacy is right now preoccupied all the citizens. So I must say that Europe is one of the leads on legislation on data protection, and I think this is one of the really advances, one of the even for businesses and for enterprises. Yes, it's becoming the protection of the privacy of the data is one of the rule changers in the business. So I think we are on the right path. We are doing it right, and we must keep pushing on this.
Okay, but that's great. It's great that we have these great protections in Europe, but I have to play devil's advocate once again, okay? So this could never have happened in Europe, this Google breach, fine, okay? I'm Google, I'm gonna take all this data from these 50 million people, I'm gonna train my AI, and I'm gonna cure cancer, and that's gonna happen in the US, and it's not gonna happen in Europe, because this data is valuable. Yes or no?
Yes, it is, and the GDPR has some occasions in which will allow you to do that. And one of the main concerns of the GDPR is investigation and research. And we see that on the GDPR, and there are some exceptions that investigation and research is allowed. But you do that respecting the principles of GDPR. You must be transparent, you must be lawful, you must do, and just explain anyone what they need to say. So,
I'd come back again to the laziness argument. Europeans can be innovative. We can cure cancer. We just don't have to be lazy about it. You know, you can do things. We saw some really wonderful talks earlier today about, ZK proof, but also about, generating, fake data from real data. So I can't remember the term that they use for it now. There's many, many really smart things we can do. So we can be the leaders, but that doesn't mean that we have to do it and compromise our ethics at the same time. So I just think we have to think a little bit more. We have to be a bit more imaginative, and we can absolutely cure cancer. Just let's do it the right way.
Well, one big advantage of this scandal is that it sheds the light on what it means to put data in the cloud. The cloud is a bunch of servers that are controlled by some corporation somewhere, and there's actually people that could access the data and process it if their lawyers say that enough hoops were jumped through. So it's the same problem that you have in the blockchain space. If people say, oh yeah, that's in the blockchain, well, if you think about it, it's copies of the data that are going to the different nodes and replicated.
Exactly.
And you need to take that into account when you start thinking about those systems. So if anything, it brings to the attention of people that there's no such thing as the cloud or the blockchain. There's a bunch of systems, IT systems, that replicate data around.
Exactly. That's the problem that we face in this blockchain community. Bart, you said before, in answer to Jonathan, that yes, these techniques are available, but they're not exactly ready for prime time. So zero knowledge and all this. So maybe we can talk a bit about that. Where are we on the curve here, and when can we really see some of these privacy-preserving technologies?
That's a good debate to have, actually.
Yeah, I know.
No, I didn't say they were not ready for prime time, and actually there were several startups, also I'm involved with some of them, that actually bring zero knowledge proofs, for example, for identity, for anonymous communications, but also you've seen others. I think they are getting ready for prime time. There is many startups also in the multi-party computation space, so this is happening. I just don't think we should, as scientists, give the impression it can be done at the same speed as unprotected data. There's going to be a price to be paid. It will be 2 orders of magnitude speed, 3 orders of magnitude. And it will already be very good. But of course, if privacy is important to us, if societal values are important, we should be willing to pay this price and be a bit slower or be more careful in how we do this. So definitely I'm a defender, but I don't think we should say it can be done at zero cost because there is no such thing as a free lunch.
So we've actually seen this on the ground. Once you start introducing this concept of separating the data from processing the data, you get into this really interesting debates. So to take the example of collaborative KYC, so you have this, like Daniel explained, this platform that has millions of users, and they want to give them the possibility of taking loans. But those loans are given by a bank, a third party. And that bank is actually getting the client's data to do the KYC process, but at the same time, they're acquiring that client as their client. So this platform is leaking their clients, their hardly acquired clients, to the banks, to third parties. And once you bring zero-knowledge proof to the game, where you separate, you can do the KYC without sending copies of the data to the bank, then all of a sudden the conversation becomes, hey, but I was actually interested in this data because I wanted to cross-sell and I wanted to actually monetize the user. Well, pay for it. Okay, so here's a debate. You think that user's, this is a business conversation now where you separate the concern between the copying of the data, the processes that need to run on the data, and the value that you will take from the data. So it's the same here. If you're going to take millions of records of people and produce value out of it, well, don't just do it without consent. Look at the incentives and try to figure out a way to do it that takes into account the incentives of all stakeholders.
I will just want to jump on it because I think there is the idea of personal data as a commodity. It's something that can be sold and something that can be traded. But never forget that behind the personal data, there are people, there are us. So we must be very careful when we treat with this data, and we need to treat it with lawfulness and also transparency, as you said, but just thinking always that behind the personal data, there is people.
I also want to comment on this monetizing, and I think it's, in my view, fundamental flaw of GDPR is consent principle, which means that privacy of data is seen as an individual decision. Well, actually, privacy is a collective good of society. And I think this is always this debate which is being reframed in collective security, individual privacy. And actually, consent can be very wrong because the individual can make a decision. But if you leak data, you may actually harm others. And a good example is the app Gaydar that was running on Facebook 10 years ago. And there are people who were gay were outed by the app based on everybody's information. So even if you, as a straight person, reveal your book preference or your music preference, you actually leak other individuals' sensitive data. And so I think it's fundamentally wrong to consider privacy on as individual thing, and the consent principle actually says the user has to consent, it's enough. No, society has to consent on what we do with things. And this data, our private data, can be used for good, as we hear about curing cancer, but also for mass surveillance and for manipulating democracy. And I think we should be very aware of this, that GDPR, as a principle of consent, actually hides a very important aspect of data protection.
Sorry, just on the kind of the other side of that, because I did a lot of work around human network analysis. And on human network analysis, the artifacts are co-owned. There is no single owner. So if I share a conversation I had with you, I'm sharing the conversation you had with me. But then if I don't share, if I'm not allowed to share the conversation that I had with you, that could damage me for some other reason. Maybe I have to prove I was somewhere because there was a police investigation, and now I can't prove I was somewhere because I can't share that I was with you. So it is a really, really tricky. I think that just means we need to spend a lot more time thinking about consent. It's not going to go away, and we can't take away the right to consent, but it is a much more complicated discussion than simply I own a particular piece of information.
Jonathan, before you jump in, just to Enrique. So from the regulatory perspective, privacy, not an individual right, but it's a societal right.
Well, that's an interesting question, really.
Glad I only have to ask them.
In this, and as in many other things, we don't have the answer. And we need to think about it, we need to discuss it and get a common approach with all our European colleagues. And I would like also to comment something on what you said, that yeah, consent is one of the principal possibilities to treat data, but it's not the only one. There are other 5 legal bases that you can use to treat, to process data. So there are more options, not only consent. There's a law, there is a public interest, there are, well, many others.
That's actually, I went through GDPR compliance for a social app solution, and that was exactly, consent wasn't the option because it was harming the individual, because I, as an employee, wanted to share information, and another employee couldn't stop me from sharing that information. So in fact, it was the business and a personal value that ended up being the sharing, not consent.
Jonathan, you wanted to come in. I'm sorry, I interrupted you before.
Yeah, maybe just to expand on this concept of privacy, we talk about privacy of individuals, but when you start sharing data too much, you sometimes end up sharing data that's actually of value to a company, and it's a matter then, you could say, of confidentiality of sensitive data, and that also is something that you need to solve. So even if you were consenting to or got the consent on private records, sometimes you're engaged in collaboration with other parties. It's not about private records, it's about your own activities, your operations, and you don't want to reveal that to other parties. So you get coverage by GDPR on those cases where you have individuals that are being concerned. But when companies want to collaborate, sometimes they still need to collaborate based on confidential data. That's not user data, it's just their own business data. And they need to have the tools to do that as well.
Yes, and I would like now to slowly move the conversation more towards from the company perspective. But I just want to keep on this one last thing. Bart, you mentioned something about we should be prepared to pay for privacy in terms of computation, in terms of things maybe being a bit slower. And I just couldn't help thinking, should we as individuals also be prepared to pay? Because we give away our data because we get a lot of free stuff for it. Should we start thinking maybe we should pay a little bit to be protected?
I wish I could pay, but there is no alternative. I went shopping for a smartphone and I wanted to look for a smartphone where I would pay a bit more, but my data would not go to any big platform, where I could actually use a map without revealing where I am, and where I could actually send information without revealing metadata, but those things don't exist. So I think in some sense there is no alternative today. And I do agree though that many users are not willing to pay. That's the other thing. I think the fact that companies don't do it is probably strategic decision they made based on the expected demand. But on the other hand, I think as society, if we take privacy seriously and if we invest so much in GDPR, we should also force companies to have an alternative and to have alternative solutions.
In the end, it's a matter of control of your data. If you're okay to have the convenience and forgo the control, then that's fine. But if you want to be more in control than mainstream, today you need to pay. Maybe mainstream will move to this new mainstream where everybody's in control of their data, and then that will be the new norm.
Yeah, the only thing I think is that most people don't understand the implications, and I think it's generational. I think it will change because we saw, so in the US a few weeks, one of the congresswomen, she resigned because of photographs that got out, and there's been a number of cases of that. I think there's going to be a whole generation of people who had everything out there without thinking of it, and all of a sudden it's going to come back to bite them in the bum at some stage in the future. So I think as we start to see more that people will be a little bit more thoughtful about, oh my God, I do want to have more control because there is a long-term implication of me not having control of my data.
Well, and in that case, that you want to regain control of your data if you ever lose it. That's why we have the rights enshrined in the GDPR, and there's the right to be forgotten and the right to modify, and you've got all the rights that are on the GDPR.
Maybe to make it all a big loop, the right to be forgotten sometimes is applied as such, you have the right to not appear in a Google search. So if you still are in databases all over the world, but Google doesn't reveal you, you were forgotten. That's how the lawmaker sees it.
I think we should be very honest. In our current architectures, you don't have the right to be forgotten. It's impossible to delete data. If you post something or you post a text or a photo, you cannot ask that it disappears from the internet. And that's some legal myth that has been created that you now have this right, but indeed, as you point out, you can get the right not to be indexed, but it's very hard, the way we build systems today, to actually prevent people from keeping information.
Okay, great. So I think we should try to bring the conversation now to more practical matters and also get back to blockchain, which is actually our subject. I'm going to start with you, Marie, and then I want to talk to you, Jonathan. When we were preparing for the panel and we had our discussions, you were telling me you've done a lot of work in the healthcare area, sort of building these ecosystems that are done the right way, and you think blockchain can be a very important element. Do you want to tell us a bit about these things you're thinking about?
Yeah, yes, and hopefully I'm not being overly naive now, but so data. So basically I spent years analyzing, collecting data, and the challenge, okay, so let me step back. So if we think about today, there is many, many bad actors out there when it comes to data, but there is also kind of this myth that, you know, big bad companies want to take your data and the poor little data subject doesn't want to give it. But the fact of the matter is that's not the way. In fact, the consumer is the person that's driving the demand for the data, because the consumer is driving this desire to have really smart apps that can predict their needs, that can, you know, do all these mundane tasks that they don't have to worry about. So I think that this idea of it being kind of just the org wanting the data and the consumer not wanting to give it is flawed. I think what we need to think about is the future data ecosystem needs to have everybody as an equal participant. So what's interesting about blockchain is specifically about self-sovereign identity, and we've been working with things like Sovereign and, you know, peer-to-peer and, you know, the exchange of credentials and verifiable credentials and all that sort of good stuff. And one of the things that's really attractive about that is it could allow the individual to be an active participant in the data ecosystem, as you kind of indicated earlier. The only challenge is that this is not the way the world works today and not the way companies work. If you think about it, for the last 30 years since the database revolution, every single organization has built their systems and their business process on this idea of the database. Then it was the data warehouse, and then it was the data lake. But it was this idea that you consolidate all the data, and it has to be there all the time. Like, it can't just be there for the purposes of execution of business process and then being deleted. It has to be around all the time. And that's the fundamental problem. So we're looking at the biggest challenge that we see is trying to get organizations to flip the world on its head and think about data differently. And it actually ends up solving a lot of problems for them. So I'll just give a very, very simple example. In healthcare, when you're enrolling in health insurance, as an example, and this is the US, like most of the work I'm doing is with the US, but so in the US today, most of the time, your company will enroll you in the health plan. So you're an employee and you provide a data to your company and they'll provide that data to the health plan. And you're not involved in that exchange of data. So you may or may not have given consent, whatever, but you're not actually visibly aware of what's being exchanged on your behalf. Now, I think this isn't good for you because you have a lack of visibility. Also, there could be data that's incorrect, that isn't accurate, but it's also not that good for the insurers either, because they get a lot of issues with incorrect data, or they spend millions every year on things like identity resolution. So it's a nightmare for them. So just imagine a different scenario where you change the ecosystem and now the individual is in the center. And what happens is the employer issues the individual with an employment credential. And that employment credential has some key pieces of information about, you know, their benefits or, you know, about their employment. Now, they can then use that credential to self-enroll with the payer, or they could also use that credential when they're renting an apartment to prove that they've got a job. So now they're the ones that are explicitly sharing that credential with the insurance company. It's being processed, and the insurance company in return is issuing them with a digital credential, which is their health plan. The thing that's nice about this is there's always consent, there's traceability, but there's also visibility, which is really important. I, as an individual, I know what data is exchanged, I have my credentials. When I then go to point of care, I'm showing my health credential. So that's kind of where we're looking at things. And if we could create that kind of ecosystem, then it becomes less about them and us, and it becomes all about us. The monetization is us, the value is us, the exchange is us. And that's, I think, where we want to go to.
So in this scenario, the enemy is a copy of the data. If you start having places in the process where your personal data gets copied and that copy goes loose, you lost control of what your data is being used. And in a way, the regulation is a form of balancing the benefits of accumulating these data lakes with making this data kind of a hot potato. You don't want the data, you want what stems from the data, but if you could avoid holding the data as an organization, avoid holding the data yourself, then you comply to GDPR and you comply to all these privacy regulations.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. In some cases, zero knowledge proof would be adequate. You know, prove that you're getting your driving license, or you're getting car tax, you have to prove you have a driving license or prove you have insurance. In some cases, absolutely, a zero knowledge proof would be adequate. In some cases, there is certain pieces of data that need to exchange. But again, at least it's a more controlled, there's consent, and there's constraints around that data. You know, how long that data can stay for, whether it stays for the 5 minutes of verification or it stays longer. So yes, there is also the risk of bleeding once you don't do zero knowledge proofs, but but at least there's a greater sense of visibility and there's a greater audit trail around what's happening with the data. So, and then you rely on a combination of technology, zero knowledge proofs, and regulation in cases where you can't, for whatever reason, use a ZKP.
Okay, but you know, how does this stuff really work? So, Jonathan, let's do a scenario, okay? I'm a potential client. Right? I work for a mid-sized corporation, and I knock on your door, and my boss has told me, Tom, go out there and get some blockchain for us, and but there's this data thing.
It's literally how it works, by the way.
Is it?
Yeah, go get some blockchain for us.
So I knock on your door.
That's 2 years ago.
I say, Jonathan, I understand you're selling some blockchain, but I've got to worry about the data. I don't want to go to, get all this GDPR fines. How are you going to explain this to me? What's going on?
The first phase is to detect that person you can talk to in the organization that is sort of
you're stuck with me, man.
A blockchain, blockchain
architect.
Okay, so you bring your blockchain architect next to you so they can nod that what we're saying is actually valid. That's a kind of first step. But if you look at it from the top, people already have this intuition that they probably need a new set of tools that they didn't have before to deal with private data, and they start hearing about zero knowledge more and more, homomorphic encryption. They hear those words more and more, and they actually want to get educated. So the first kind of introductory talk is, okay, so what can these tools bring you? They're not super concerned how it works. They're more concerned that there's 300 professors that are working together to standardize this thing with NIST. That's kind of enough to induce trust in the technology, but they want to know what can this thing do for me and how it can put me either in compatibility with things like GDPR or actually outside of GDPR regime. I'm no longer putting any data out there that's private data. They start a sort of education. The next phase, of course, is experimenting with this. So you have pioneers that are in this space. Our very first experiment was with a French bank, BNP Paribas, who was using this to check for collateral in a loan, to see that you didn't double spend the same collateral with 2 different banks, so avoid fraud on collateral. So the first experiments were very quick because they did realize that blockchains, naive sharing blockchains are probably not the way to collaborate. And now you have a second phase where we're talking to regulators. So we're talking to mostly in Asia, I must say. So they're a little bit more advanced on adopting zero knowledge as a construct that actually proves statement. There's a parallel that most people are familiar with. That's public key cryptography or digital signatures. Today we sign digitally lots of things we do, and we don't concern ourselves about what exactly is the RSA modulus that's underneath, and if it's an elliptic curve or if it's quantum resistant. That's because there's a bunch of standards that stand behind the technology, and it was adopted widely. So we're getting the first pieces of adoption that show the way on how to use this tech.
I'm sorry, but
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, but I must disagree. The first part, it's okay. when you just go rushing to find some blockchain anywhere and put it in anywhere. But the second thing you must do, first of all, is if you detect that you are going to process personal data, is do it and think about what you are going to do a risk analysis. This is stated in the GDPR also. First, a risk analysis. How I'm going to process the data, what are the risks that I'm facing, and how are the possible solutions that I can find in order to avoid the risk or minimize the risk. Second, if you cannot minimize the risk enough, you must do a DPIA, Data Protection Impact Assessment. And even though you are not perfectly convinced that everything you are doing it right, go to your preferred DPA and ask them and show them all your work you've been doing and tell them, am I doing right? Am I allowed to do this? Is that everything that I'm going to do, is it correct? Because the main point, one of the main points of GDPR is accountability. So you need to be accountable of what you are doing, because we are treating with a fundamental right, which is the data protection.
So the level of debate in the blockchain team when they're thinking about tokenizing a use case and then deploying it in a POC internally and then moving forward to building consortia, that conversation about am I actually processing private data arrives usually super late, because you don't. They're thinking, well, blockchain. It's the same argument as, well, cloud. So of course that's an oversimplification, but when you're moving a token, you don't think of the movement of a token as processing, but what ends up being happening in your blockchain node is taking records that represent activities of people and analyzing their validity, and then creating new records that represent activities of people. There's a whole topic of security tokens, or stable coins, right? This new money and new form of money that will run on a blockchain. This is kind of the other half of this conference, is the privacy, and there's stable coins. Well, stable coins is human activity represented as records on a ledger. And those records should be treated as some form of processing of private data, but it's hard to see it this way. It's not directly obvious that that's the case. So that expert in GDPR that I will knock on the door probably will have a little bit of a hard time to change that the perspective of transactions on a blockchain to the framework of GDPR.
I don't want to monopolize, the conversation, but there's an article very nice that I love it, which is Privacy by Design. So the first thing you need to think about is the privacy if you are treating with personal data. And just a thought that I always wanted to mention, there was a boat, I think Lithuania it was called, that really after the Titanic sank, there was a rule that everybody has to have enough saving boats, lifeboats for every passenger in the boat. And what they did was put all the lifeboats on top of the Lithuania. And when he departed from the port, it went around because all the weight was on top of the boat, and it sank. So from that until now, there is not a good idea. Just think of privacy at the end.
Okay, Bart, maybe I can turn to you, because I actually wanted to get to the privacy by design discussion, and to stay in our scenarios. So Bart, I've been to Jonathan to try and buy some blockchain. He seems like a nice guy. I'd like to buy some blockchain and some privacy from Jonathan, but I really don't understand it. So I've been referred to you. and the question really is, I mean, you're excited about blockchain and you're very interested in privacy by design. How can we use this technology and these privacy-preserving technologies in a right way?
Well, I think, of course, in blockchain, you get the accountability, transparency. You get it more or less by definition of the construction. So you have the bigger concern is privacy. Technologies, I mean, I think the previous talk explained it very well. Also, Jonathan, I'm not going to repeat that. More or less, this is an invention of Professor Mikali, who will talk later, how you can prove certain things without showing them. And they've been shown to be useful, for example, to prove your identity without revealing. You can prove you're a citizen, or you can prove you have a certain age. That's definitely something you can do. And also, Zcash is a good example how you can even prove things about transactions without revealing them. I think the problem there is if we become too successful, we will build an anonymous payment system, which I think will undermine our societies. So that's something to think about, but definitely it's possible. Maybe something we haven't discussed yet is privacy is very hard because we discussed layer 1, which is the Bitcoin or Ethereum layer. You have layer 2, people put applications on top, say anonymous identities with anonymous credentials, and this is being studied by, or being developed, for example, also by a company I've been working with, NIM Technologies, but they also look at layer 0, which is if you do a payment on an anonymous blockchain, or even if your data is anonymized, you keep having your IP packet attached to everything you do, or your MAC address. And so you actually also need anonymity technologies at network layer. And so NIM Technologies is a company that's working on this, trying to do it in a distributed way, in an open way, in a permissionless way, which is properly incentivized. So these ideas, again, go back to the 80s, work of Schaum, but there has been no really global working solution. So this is something you can actually add. So this is the difficulty about privacy, is that you can't just worry about one layer. Privacy you only get by worrying about all the layers, which makes it very hard. But it's possible. I think that's something which is the good news is, so the bad news is it's hard. The good news is we're making progress and we're getting there eventually. I think the long-term question is also how far do we want to go with it? Because if we're too successful, we're going to undermine society.
This is one of the challenges of standardizing zero knowledge, is that what level do you stop? You want to reach end-to-end privacy. That's the goal. You want to make sure that your protocols don't leak data at any level. If, for example, you have securities that are being tokenized, and all of a sudden there's a big drop in I don't know which company to take as an example. I don't know, the Google ticker goes down, we're with Google today, and you see on your ledger, you don't see who sends what to who, but you see that there was a big move of that specific asset. At some point in time, you can link the transactions and do some analysis from just the metadata on the transactions. You can front run the market with such data. So you end up having concerns on all those different layers, like you said. And when you come to standardize this, you don't stop at just this is the zero knowledge proof scheme that's the most efficient. You need to combine this with how it is used in a protocol, how that protocol is used in an application, and how it's deployed, in the field, and have recommendations on all of these topics. It's it gets very opinionated. You need to say how to use this tech outside of this tech.
So I think that's fantastic, because I think we've actually come around full circle to the question we had at the beginning of the panel, which is, dealing with this balance between the need and desire for privacy and the need and desire and value of information. I really want to thank you guys. It's been great. I'd like to turn it over to the questions from the audience. So if you think I was asking pain questions, we'll see what will come from the audience. Do we have the Slido? Oh no, they'll be coming. They'll be coming. I mean, here we go. So, well, there we are. Question number one is exactly the topic. What would happen if we do not regulate privacy protection at all? So the opposite end of the spectrum.
Well, I think there is many studies that have shown that both security and privacy will fail because you get market failures. And so I think it's definitely an area where we do need regulation. And my point of view is also we need stronger regulation than the one we have now, because, for example, GDPR is a model for the world. It's definitely not perfect, but it's getting followed globally. But for example, GDPR says nothing about intelligence services. This is outside the scope of EU. And we do know that IT systems we've been building have been used for mass surveillance. And I think one big concern I have is that if blockchain becomes successful, imagine you're the NSA. This is fantastic. Everybody puts everything on a central system and you can get all the data there. Even if it's encrypted, you can use the metadata, which NSA is also very good. So I think if there is no regulation at all, we'll end up with a system of global mass surveillance. And I'm afraid we're already sliding there, and regulation is not strong enough to prevent this.
And could I, one thing as well, I think that we need a top-down and we need a bottom-up, and the bottom-up is much harder. So the top-down, clearly we need regulation, we need government, we need people to be held accountable if they do things that are unethical with people's data. But we also need a bottom-up, which we need a society that is more educated about what their data is. And I think this comes from the transparency and the reason why we need a new data ecosystem where all citizens are participants and that slowly over time they become more savvy and more aware of data. It's the same issue we have with just, I hate the term fake news, but we have a whole generation of people who are trying to educate to be more thoughtful and careful and cautious and dig a little bit deeper when they see things. So I think we have to educate our the communities to understand the risk and the reward of data, and then clearly we need a top-down approach as well.
Yeah, my point on this is if there was no regulation, we had to invent it. Because there's a real need on the people and everyone that they're becoming more conscious that the data, the personal data, in a society data-driven is the people. So as in the same way that we realize that we need human rights, one of the human rights is personal data.
If I can add to that, even if there was no regulation for people, from a business perspective, companies would have invented those tools anyway. It's tools that are needed to perform business operations where it's a business incentive not to share your data and spread it in the wide. So those tools would have come up with less backup from GDPR, but they would still be present. And talking about those tools, I see that second question is exactly on the efficiency of those tools. Elephant in the room.
One second. Yeah, you want to read the question? Because it's not up there.
Okay.
So the second question is getting back to the issue of the cost of this and the performance cost. Again, the elephant in the room, what is the performance overhead of zero-knowledge proofs in realistic application scenarios? And what does this imply for practical viability? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I wanted to pick this one. This is already happening on the ground. So the cryptocurrency that you talked about, Zcash, has managed to bring the time to produce a proof to make a transaction to the low seconds, so 1 or 2 seconds per transaction. It is heavy cryptography because you're basically proving that the calculation that you would have done on your computer, you're reproducing that calculation in a way that takes a trace of the calculation and proves that all the steps were performed. So it's kind of a simulation of a CPU almost that is done in cryptography. It is heavy, but for practical use cases, you already see deployments. For example, in all those places where you don't have thousands of transactions per second, you have hundreds of transactions per second. And then if each node produces maybe 50 transactions per second, the sum of all transactions is exactly fit for the use case. This is already happening today. And of course, shameless plug, there are companies that face exactly this challenge of making solving scalability for these technologies.
I think I can confirm the analysis. Maybe it's good to remind people this is a long time ago, but actually In the late 80s or early 90s, Kamal Plus rolled out a zero-knowledge scheme because for identification, the VHMIR protocol is more efficient than signatures or the other public key protocols. So in fact, for some things, the computational overhead is lower. But in general, of course, for blockchain applications, the overhead is larger, but it's becoming feasible. And I think there will always be a gap, but I think it can be reasonable. And we still have Moore's law on our side, I would say.
Okay, the next two questions are actually quite good ones. I'm glad we have them. The first one, I'm going to start with you, Enrique. It's basically the question, has the GDPR really served to protect people, or all of these privacy pop-ups that we get, which we don't even read, basically? I mean, I certainly don't, and that we agree to, just kind of actually doing the opposite of what they're intended to do, which is giving these corporations license to do what they want with our data, because they say, hey, you clicked OK.
I think you are, well, the people is referring to the cookie banners that have appeared. Funny enough, that's not GDPR. That's e-privacy, which is another legislation, piece of legislation. And it's right now they are changing it. Right now it's a directive, and they will want to do a regulation. And well, they are trying to change this. By the way, we in the Data Protection Authority, we just published a guideline on cookie and how to manage them, and how to ask for permission. So it's a hot issue really in for us. And well, I think GDPR is working. There are people being aware of their rights of privacy. That at not so much time there was something just for the ones on it, and this is the knowledge is spreading. So I think GDPR is working from my point of view, from my perspective.
I think it's going in the right direction, and I think it does stop the most outrageous abuses. You cannot do certain things anymore. On the other hand, to be so self-congratulatory about it, I think we have a very long way to go. Our data still goes to the NSA, it still goes to GCHQ, we're still mass surveilled. I think also there are no meaningful alternatives. There is the big words privacy by design in GDPR, but in practice, most designs I'm using every day, because this is the only way, is actually not privacy by design. It's collect my information by design and agree to that. And I think it's possible to do it in a distributed way, but we actually have to change things completely, and it seems that the current framework is not strong enough to enforce this.
So can you scroll back actually one question? But one of the questions is about educating consumers on privacy. So my question is, can we do more? If people really knew more, would there be more clamor for real privacy protection that actually has teeth in it?
I think there's a challenge that people have enough to get their head around already. So that's why I do think it has to be top down, bottom up. I think if you need to, it's like standards. You need to be confident that as a European citizen, that the regulation is there to protect you. So you need to at least know that there's certain things companies can't do. So you can at least feel somewhat secure in that there's certain things they can't do. But at the same time, you can't just defer it all off to regulation. You have to take some responsibility for what you're giving permission to. And that is an education thing and I don't even know how we're going to do that, because it's something we've been struggling for a long time to try and get people to care, and we can't. So I don't know what that says.
I'm very concerned that actually the majority of the population doesn't have the mental model to understand the difference between all those complex building blocks we're putting there. And I think if I use a power plug, I plug it in and I know it works, it's not going to produce sparks, and it's not going to do really bad things. So there is some guarantee there, and I know that the digital world is much more complex, but I really think that increasing the cognitive load on users, I think it's not the right approach. It should be, as a point of view of society, it should be by default in every solution.
Yeah, and in order to have this regulation be applied with the best tools available, it needs to take into account that data is not necessarily always copied around, and as long as you have the wording of the regulation not tell you how to do things, but tells you what is what you're trying to reach, you'll be able to use every new tool that's available on the market.
And I think we'll leave it at that. I believe our time has come to an end. I'd like to thank you all very, very, very much. Bart, Marie, Enrique, Jonathan, for an excellent panel. Let's have a hand for our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, for moderating this panel. Thank you, panelists, for enlightening us today on the privacy. I would like to invite everybody to please take their seats, as we are having some very special guests coming up. So please take your seats if you want to. Also, after the conference, there is a nice drinks that will be served where we had lunch. So we want to invite you, obviously, to come there as well. And next to that, we'll just wait a couple of minutes for the closure of this program.